Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show. The O Show is a live performance piece that mines the conventions of daytime TV talk shows for all that they're worth. It features artists and other experts who have no difficulty spilling the beans about their lives and opinions, especially when they defy norms and conventions. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. I'm thrilled to be speaking today with the artist, academic, and entrepreneur, Dr. Ope Lori. Her lens-based work addresses the politics of looking, of desire, pleasure, and power. She provocatively challenges the dominant forms of representation in our culture, aimed as they are towards providing eye candy for a particular gaze. That is the white, male, heterosexual gaze. By putting herself behind the camera and at times in front of it, she centers her own vision. But her work goes above and beyond the strategies of reversal and reappropriation that many feminist artists employ, and brings particular attention to the politics of race and its impact on the perception of gender. As a Black British Nigerian lesbian, her gaze automatically is oppositional to dominant modes of looking. The way she frames this perspective in her work has been, for me personally, extremely eye-opening, shining a spotlight on the ubiquity of white beauty standards and the use of Black women as props to uphold whiteness as the feminine ideal. I feel like I sound a tad naive saying how enlightening her work is for me. I've been aware that beauty standards are white, but I haven't been totally naive about that, but her work has really helped me to not take color for granted. Importantly, her work makes plain how detrimental stereotypical representations of femininity are to all women, making the need for collective action, not just to go against, but to surpass, really critical. Her work provides the tools to see differently. I'm going to still go on. It's long. Having completed her PhD in 2014, she worked as an academic for several years, but last December she quit her teaching gig and started an organization called PILAA, Pre-Image Learning and Action, which utilizes her expertise in lens-based media to create visual work and training towards equality, diversity, and inclusion. PILAA is working to shatter stereotypes and challenge perceptions, to tackle the root causes as well as the symptoms. They worked with an impressive range of clients, including galleries like the Tate and Whitworth, as well as business consulting firms and security services, and the British Armed Forces. If you ever questioned what difference representation can make outside of the gallery space and in the world, you need look no further than Dr. Ope Lori's trailblazing work. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And that was a brilliant introduction.
I'm glad you liked it. I actually read most of your PhD. I really wanted to read all of it, actually. I was surprised because, normally someone sends you their PhD and you're like, yeah, I really am interested. And you're like, maybe I'll read some of it. But I actually was like, I couldn't put it down, but I still ran out of time to read the last chapter. So you'll have to fill me in on...
Oh my gosh, you're going to have to fill me in. I've completely forgotten. Actually, no, that's a lie. I mean, I say I've forgotten, but the funny thing is I'm actually writing a book, and the book is based off the PhD. But as you can imagine, that was 2014. So much has happened. Some things have remained the same, but obviously there's so much. And, people change. I change. My views kind of somewhat change. They're still pretty much the same, but, they've moved on so much in that, space of 7 years, have we?
Yeah. So, that's exciting that you're going to write a book. I think it's really a book that needs to be written. So I'm really excited to hear that. Yeah. So I don't know. What's the first question I have?
Hopefully it's not about the PhD because...
No, it's not about that. It's more, I guess it's about like representational strategies and, liberating oneself from the kind of hold that like white beauty standards have on you, and like using the tactic of putting yourself in the frame or changing the way Black women are represented in your imagery? Like, how do you feel like, what works do you feel like have been really successful, or what tactics are you most fond of?
Okay, so let's just put it this way. So, because actually yesterday I was having a really interesting conversation, as you do, with someone, and this question around representation came up. And it always reminds me of, Jack Halberstam, the work of Jack Halberstam, and it was in their book, Gaga Feminism. And they spoke about this particular, I think they were speaking about a film, and then they used this particular line, which is be the game, play the game, know the game, be the game, play the game, and then change the game. And that has been something that has stuck with me when people are thinking about, how do we change things? How do we, combat or challenge things? We still need to know what the game is. And the thing is, you still need to be in that game to try and make any sort of difference. So that's been really, really important for me as a kind of mantra and also as a working strategy. So I would say one of the key works, sometimes I forget this work, and it was really, really important because I think that was the moment where I had kind of like a eureka moment, where it's like, it was an epiphany. So in my earlier days of making work, as a Black woman, as he says, a lesbian Black woman, I was making work around the visibility of Black women in general. I could probably see what a lot of people see, in the ways that Black women are depicted. I wanted to make Black women visible. But it wasn't just Black women on themselves. It was about how Black women were seen in relation to white women. So whenever they occupy the same frames of reference, if you see them in screen images, if you see them in particular films, how would both of them appear in relation to gender ideals? So if you was a Black woman, would she be portrayed as feminine when she was next to a white woman? And normally you'd always get Black woman equals masculine, so she'll be a bit more predominantly masculine, more dominant. Whether she had a job or a role, she'll be a very dominant job. Then you get the white woman who'd be more feminine, in a passive role, right? So you always had this equation. So I always kept noticing that. And so in the early days, it was about really trying to challenge that dominant narrative that I would see. But then I made this particular work called Durational. And that work, and again, that was around 2009. So, it's quite a long time ago. But that was just to reference how Black women were not seen in Black British music videos. So we're talking about R&B videos. So you're thinking of a space where predominantly be Black music, and you're not seeing Black bodies. And even when you do see maybe Black bodies, there'll be very light-skinned Black bodies. Mm-hmm. So this particular work, I think I used maybe 9 Black British videos or musicians' songs at that time, which were quite popular. And in none of them, there were no Black women. So you had these Black male artists, but no Black women in these videos. And it's something that a lot of people have spoken about, whether it's Black British videos, whether it's American videos. And what I did was literally, as a Black woman, it was quite interesting because it's quite, I suppose, quite a out there piece of work for people who may not have seen my work. So you see me, I know I have to laugh about it, but I know sometimes people have been like, oh my gosh, you're so brave for doing what you did. So you see me dancing separately, and it's called deracination because to deracinate means to uproot yourself. It means to see yourself as quite alienated. So you're uprooting yourself. So you see myself dancing on one side, semi-nude. I mean, I did have knickers on, so I wasn't that brave. And then I think I could have gone further, to be fair, but I was quite young at that time. And then so it's a 2-screen image. One side, you see me dancing semi-nude, and on the right-hand side, you see these 9 videos, these 9 music videos. And in those 9 music videos, where they've shown white women, I've literally used a black masking tool to eradicate their faces. So you can see their bodies dancing, but they're faceless. But you can obviously see all of me. So we're talking about the kind of binary between being seen and not being seen, and completely flipping the script. The other element to that song was that the sound over, I didn't use the music, I got rid of the music, but I actually had one of those old school children ballerinas songs, the one that went like, mm-hmm. I don't want to whistle it because I think it's too early to whistle, but I think something like, oh, I can't whistle. It went along like that.
Like a classic kind of waltz.
Thank you very much. A classic waltz. And obviously, growing up as a little girl, it wasn't something I was fond of. I never had all the girls' toys. I didn't want all the kind of girls' toys. So again, it was that play on feminine ideals, what it means to be a woman. And then you're having this dichotomy. So, it was quite powerful work. But I think when I did that, on reflection of what I did, so for example, actually erasing these white women's faces, is like, what is that doing? And I thought, in that moment, I felt I was doing an act of violence. So in trying to now make Black women visible, it felt like the only way I could do that was to erase white women. And that didn't it didn't feel comfortable. It didn't feel right. So for me, it's almost like a catch-22. And it's almost like I came to see the situation for what it was. Both of us, actually, Black women and white women. My struggle was just for Black women, but actually the struggle is for all women because we're both objectified, but in different ways. Black women, yes, we're not seen, but we're not trapped in representation that way. On the flip side, you got white women who are just littered everywhere. You go to historical images of women in museums. They're still nude, so we're objectified, but in different ways. And that, for me, was the kind of turning point for a lot of the work that I did. So instead of it just being about, okay, well, Black women need to be seen, actually it was like, you know what? I don't want to swear because I'm sure it's a show that doesn't include swearing, but I was like...
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, to hell with this representation, to hell with wanting to be seen, to hell with, this kind of desire. And actually, what would it mean to say, fuck you to the system, and for actually both of us to not do that? Because once we both are very conscious and aware of this, then actually the system doesn't have anything to go on. So that was the turning point. It's such a significant piece of work. I'm still very, very fond of it.
That was the first work by you. Sorry, that was the first work by you that I saw.
Yeah, and it's a work which definitely has been spoken about, written about since. I'm fond of it. Even speaking about it now, I was like, oh, actually, that was a really good piece of work.
Yeah. So that's what I was trying to get at in my introduction. But I just couldn't figure out the best way of putting it. It's like, yes, you saw that this was, that representation as it is detrimental for all women, and that the solution wasn't necessarily reversal or to remove the faces of of the lighter skinned women or white women, and wasn't necessarily the solution, or it's just still pointing out the problem. Like about a lot of the role, I think, of feminist artists is like pointing out the problem. Before we can even begin to think about like what alternative we could produce. But there was something else you were talking about. Oh yes, so this has made me think about when I teach at a kind of traditional art school, and we teach like a whole module on bodies and context, and it starts off like one of the sessions is on the nude. And it occurred to me this year. I mean, obviously, I'm for a while I've been trying to like find ways to decolonize the curriculum and all that. But I really felt like to have sessions devoted to the nude just automatically is problematic, because there just aren't, or there haven't been that many Black nudes. Like, so it's automatically exclude or Black nudes by Black painters. Like, they're just, it just feels automatically kind of like impossible to decolonize in a way. It's like I have to start with a completely different framework. I feel like I'm going on a tangent here, but I don't know. I'm not sure what to do about that, or I don't know. So
So the issue, I mean, you just said, okay, so Black nudes by Black painters, but are you speaking about you said you're talking about decolonizing, I don't want to say the curriculum, but what are you trying to decolonize, and what would it mean then that you're using Black artists?
I just feel like focusing on the nude is like automatically the wrong frame of reference in a way. It automatically then situates white male painters as central, as is the canon, and anything departing from that is, it automatically marginalizes. Yeah, just taking that frame. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be very difficult for you, though, to not do it because it's so much part of art history. And I think in the day, there's people like myself and other artists who've challenged that. And I think that's, for me, that is what is interesting. It's like, it's almost like a guilty pleasure. Just because you're critiquing something doesn't mean that you can still not get something from that. And there's loads of artists who have really challenged that kind of typical, traditional, gaze. And actually, I'm very fond of, there's a few artists I'm fond of their work, from a Jamu to Sadie Lee, and actually speak about their practice in my particular book. And also Marcia Michael, really challenge that kind of historical white male or dominant gaze. Sometimes I say male gaze, so I say male because they're the dominant, but it's not necessarily just about that as well. I think at some point we also have to acknowledge that, we also have agency as well. That is also our gazes. I don't really necessarily see it as problematic, but it'll be interesting now to bring in a range of people who have really challenged what that looks like and also move beyond it as well. And I think you started off really nicely when you did introduction. It's also about just trying to move beyond perhaps these prescriptive ways of thinking about things and doing things. I think that's actually part of a lot of my work, is about how do you move beyond prescriptive ways of doing something or conditioned ways of doing something.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, so one thing I do is I show like my old work from when I was a BA student, where I did exactly what John Berger says you should do, which is you reverse the gender of the people depicted. So I did lots of male nudes, and copied the kind of structure of traditional paintings. And I feel like, and obviously, in your thesis, you point to several artists who kind of, they've reversed the race of like Olympia, Manet's Olympia. And so that same kind of, I absolutely, like, that's one way of doing it, is like pointing to all the kind of responses and I think, workings.
I think, there's so many ways of doing it. And, there's a term that I'm using at the moment, which is, it's not a term, it's a word, multitudinal as well. So like, even think about multitudinal approaches stretching over time as well. I spoke about a particular work. I've just actually done a work for a commission at Autograph, and it's part of their, always forget the title, but it's part of their Care Contagion Community Self and Other. So it's literally about to be released. And, in that work, I've actually, the two works which I made, they do revisit and challenge these kind of historical ways of understanding, the odalisque pose, seeing different figures. But actually, I'm not just critiquing gender. I'm actually critiquing familial lineage. I'm critiquing it over time. What does it mean to self-reflect on what I've done now and maybe who I was 10 years ago? So I think it's about really trying to stretch all the possibilities in that. And I suppose some people don't want to see that. It's not something that we probably talk of as much. When people talk about intergenerational approaches, I think if we did factor some of those things in, we might have a completely different conversation about what we think is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do.
Yeah. So that's so intergenerational, like, in what sense? Can you just say more about that?
Yeah, maybe I'm going off the work thing, but I think, we have so many, it's all about context, isn't it? You can have certain terms and it will mean something now, but actually 5-10 years later, it will mean something completely different. You will have communities that will understand one word, and then you'll have a younger generation who will see it completely differently. And I think we need to perhaps bring those conversations right to the same space, because we're all experiencing it, but just from different lenses across time, across space. And I think that would be really interesting. It's a little bit like Star Trek. I'm not necessarily a Star Trek person, but I've been watching a lot of the new one, which is Star Trek Discovery. And
my partner's always trying to get me to watch that, and I'm just like, I can't.
You need to listen to your partner. You need to listen to your partner. Maybe I watch it predominantly. Well, I don't want to say predominantly, because I did watch the ones with when it was Janeway, Voyager. Was it Voyager? So maybe I've got an affinity to watching ones where it's either a woman who's the captain, or in this recent one, the black woman's the main protagonist, which she's absolutely amazing. But, sometimes they do all those, for Star Trek people, you'll see the same thing, but across different alternative spaces. So it's like that in itself is just amazing. There you go.
I'll have to take your word for it. I'll give it a try. But what you were saying, though, was really interesting, though, about like looking at your old work and seeing, the differences. But so, yeah, that's exactly the point, is that strategy I used when I was doing my, BA painting of reversal was obviously something that I discovered was like too limited, because the same kind of hierarchy of value of looking remains unchanged, it's so, and also there's nothing to necessarily situate, a particularly feminine gaze or female gaze. Like it could be a painting for a gay male audience, for example, as opposed to, it doesn't necessarily make a feminine or gaze prominent or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's I suppose what it is, and actually all of these things are all necessary, I guess, they're all parts to one big puzzle. But I think it was just the fact that, okay, some of these things are just symbolic. It doesn't mean that it's actually going to change the situation. Okay, I switch over the polarities, but what does it do in essence? And it's really funny, actually, because I think recently, maybe about 4 or 5 months ago, just after the whole George Floyd, the tragic murder of George Floyd, obviously we know that last year there's been so much happening around, really trying to challenge these inequalities, structural racism, whatever have we. So I think there was either an event, I think it was based in America, and they were trying to, again, challenge these systems of oppression or racist structures. And one of the things that we're going to do is to rewrite the Golden Girls. And they brought instead of using that, obviously we know the Golden Girls, I watched it briefly when I was a little bit younger, they used an all-black cast, like proper, celebrity black women who replaced these white women. And, they had a brilliant image, but I thought, okay, well, what is that going to do? I like the sentiment of it, because like you just said, we've been there, we've done that. It looks brilliant symbolically, but is this just a one-off? Will this actually change how many black women are actually getting certain roles in this industry? So it's almost like it's surface level. And again, I think it's all necessary. Like everything is definitely needed to challenge this system, but it can only go so far.
Yeah. So many things to say in response to that. First of all, I interviewed an artist, actually, Indrani Ash, who works with a collective of two other artists, and they call themselves the Golden Brown Girls. Okay. Or no, they did their own take on the Golden Girls. Wow. Called the Golden Brown Girls, and they made their own. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. They did their own version, but it's basically them. It's them as their older selves, like a kind of projected fantasy image of their future as artists, and as they go on to have retrospectives or whatever in later life, and it's really great. You should
Wow, I love that. I'm definitely taking a note of that. The Golden Brown Girls.
It's quite funny. The Golden Brown Girls, yeah. But the other thing was about this whole representation versus life, and because basically my PhD thesis is all about that kind of question of actions done for the sake of representation or within performance art specifically, or performances to the camera, such as in your work, how that then impacts on the artist's life. And because it's all about, it's just as, for a lot of performance artists, it's just as much about experience as it is about representation. So doing these things have had impacts on their lives because they want to create a new life. They want to create a different world, and that starts often with the personal. And so, with the thesis, mostly focuses on actually beauty standards and what I don't know, using cosmetics or using surgery or working out or those kinds of interventions we can do to transform the self. And I look at the paradigm of before and after. I thought it was interesting in your work how you do kind of after Newton. And it's about kind of spot the difference and a kind of sense of before and after, but not quite in the same way. And I'm trying to, like, I really want to know more about, like, if challenging these kind of representational codes in your work, like how that then impacted, like, maybe how you know, the things you do, like, to present yourself in the world, or yeah.
It's a good question because you know, I suppose that's the typical or the well-known feminist phrase, which is a personal to political, and it's a little bit like the chicken and the egg. I can't tell you which one comes first, but I think from a very young age I was very aware of how media images or looking at the TV could be instrumental in how one's identity is formed. I think I was very aware of that. And also I was very aware of how dangerous it could be very early on. But, you know, as I said at the beginning, sometimes even when you find something very challenging, you still really like it. So I've always loved media images. I've always loved films. I always loved video. I've always kind of loved photography. I've always liked performance. And, you know, it just reminds me of, I suppose, my very first earliest kind of conception of this was when I was watching Snow White. And I speak about this quite a lot because, again, you know, even at 7 years old when I watched it, I think it was the 1937 version. And I'm sure there was a little bit of colour in that one, Technicolor, whatever have we. It was so significant, even as a 7-year-old. And I think even that age is actually quite an important age. And I remember watching it, and I have 2 sisters and an older brother. And so we're all like 2 years apart. And when we were watching it, so my older sister was probably 9, my little sister was 5. And I remember watching it, and I was just so in awe of Snow White. I mean, Snow White, it was a cartoon. Funnily enough, I actually watched this maybe 2 years ago, watching Snow White. And and again, this is why I say sometimes it's important to see things over time as well, because when you come back to it, it's the same self watching the same thing, but again, I'm understanding it from a different lens. You know, a person of 30 years older, now that I'm 37, I'm 30 years older. And at the time, I remember watching it and I just thought, wow, this girl is just so hot. Like, so maybe that's my lesbian self coming out as well. But she was hot. I mean, or she was good looking and she was beautiful. I mean, that's the emphasis. Snow White was beautiful. She's so beautiful that even the birds were chirping, even the animals and the grass, they were all like bowing to Snow White. So I even fell in love with Snow White. So straight after watching it, I remember like I literally skipped. I skipped upstairs. I skipped upstairs. I went into the bathroom and I found talcum powder. And I literally just caked my face with the talcum powder. And I just thought, wow. And then I remember skipping as she did, or, you know, the music, skipped back downstairs, showed my 2 sisters, and they just probably thought, what on earth is this girl doing? They obviously didn't get it. And I was like, how can you not get how beautiful I am? So now I skipped. I skipped, clearly forgetting myself. I skipped to my dad. And my dad was like, not even like, I mean, you know, he's a typical Nigerian man. And, you know, I'm sure he scolded me for doing that. But in that moment of scolding, obviously, I just thought, wow, what I've done was like, again, that was another eureka moment. I thought, this is terrible. Like, what have I just done? I've just literally denounced myself, my blackness, because I was in awe of this feminine ideal. And not just feminine ideal, this white feminine ideal. So I was very, very aware of the power of TV to influence how one is seen. And that's why a lot of my work was really challenging those media images, because they do have a lot of impact. It's almost like you have to think, what comes first? Is it because I've sucked in these images? This is why they say, you know, sometimes you have to be very conscious when you're watching certain things, because actually, subconsciously, you can actually take these things in. So I understood, I think from that moment, the feminine ideal. I also understood that I was not in that place. Like, you know, for anyone else, we just don't fit into that. So that was really important. And I think maybe the second thing, which was quite, I suppose, related to that was my relationship. You know, it's a long time ago, but one of my first relationships with a woman, it was an interracial relationship. And it was very interesting how both of us would be perceived to the outside world. And again, I can't help but think that some of this is also played on by the media, played on by watching videos, watching films, watching lesbian dramas. Whenever, again, you would see Black women with white women in either interracial couplings, it was always a Black woman who would take a more masculine, dominant approach. I looked at the L Word. I know they've done a new one now, the new generation, where they have actually flipped the script. But in the older versions, it was always the Black women who would take that dominant role. Then you had the wife or the girlfriend, passive, feminine, and that's the trope that you'd see all the time. So when people now would see us, they'll say, okay, yes, well, you're obviously clearly the most dominant. And then as a white feminine woman, yes, you're obviously the feminine partner. And, I think there's stereotypes with that as well, because I know within certain communities, especially for maybe femme women, it's almost like, well, you're not really seen or heard. Well, you really can't be a lesbian then, because you obviously look like you're straight or something. So, we're both again trapped in our visibility.
Yeah. So that's something that I definitely was really eye-opening for me when I did the female masculinity episode of the O Show, where I didn't realize how much norms of heterosexuality had an impact on queer and lesbian kind of life, this, and just the kind of dominance of butchness as the sort of privileged position over feminists, and that kind of mapped onto their world and their kind of hierarchies or whatever. And then again, with your work, that was also eye-opening, how that then is racialized, exactly what you're saying. And so it's, but so I guess, maybe that's where it comes in, because if you were a masculine of center Black woman or Black lesbian, then it would be kind of, it's just there's all these basically different frameworks of norms that you're breaking with maybe the norm of femininity, but within the context, within a queer context, you're keeping the norm of being the masculine one. And it's just there's these different levels, and to be free, to be liberated, from it. where do you turn, or should one then be more feminine, seek to be more
it's true,
traditionally feminine? It's a mind fuck, basically.
Thank you, that's a brilliant word. It's a mind fuck. It's a never ending, unpacking, unraveling. That's the thing. And I think my main thing is that these positions are not fixed. I think if we know that it's not fixed, and that sometimes these things are prescriptive behaviours, they're conditioned, and actually I think there's a lot of empowerment, or there's a lot of power just from that very notion that they're not fixed. Because then you wouldn't have, and I suppose I speak about this a bit, and actually in this new book I return to this, the teachings of Paulo Freire, and just really understanding what is oppressor, what is the oppressed, and actually knowing that at some time these will also flip. This oppressor and oppressed is also in ourselves, right? And I think just having that freedom to know that, to know that there's just different and multiple subject positions that will change over time. Context is everything as well, so I think just allowing that for me is just, I suppose that is that act of freedom or liberational kind of thinking.
But how does it transform into action? How do you, in terms of a really superficial thing, just styling oneself, going out into the world?
You mean on my everyday?
How you're dressed with your,
my everyday.
And your
it's an interesting one, because I think there's times when you can just become bog standard general and get very basic about what you're doing and how you dress.
Yeah, I'm very basic, I guess, in how I dress in everyday life. But obviously not as the O show host, but in my everyday life, I'm quite basic. I'm normcore, I think someone else called it.
Normcore, it's true. Do you know what it is? I just say that I'm doing me. And that sounds like very much of this time and era of doing me. But technically I am. I think over the years, I've definitely thought about, my starting point has always been around this ideal of femininity and knowing that I didn't necessarily fit into that. So the masculine or the masculinity was more of a I don't say a byproduct, but it's more of a byproduct. So I suppose I'm more comfortable in how I dress. And I think I mix it up a little bit. In the kind of lesbian and gay community, I think especially across the Black lesbian, bi, and queer community, for women who are kind of like in the middle of being femmes or studs. So studs, I would say, is probably more butch, more dominant. You get someone like myself. So they may call me a STEM. So I'm, you can see, exactly. There you go. I'm a STEM. I'm in between, in the middle of being femme and being a stud. But actually, I don't really see myself as being femme in that way. But I do understand it. And I would say that if anything, I came up with another term. I think the term's probably used by different people, but I always say I'm a gentlewoman. So I'm the best of both. Right. But even then, I think that sounds like a gentleman. So anyway, I'm in the middle. And when I dress.
Well, there's that great magazine, Gentlewoman. I only read there's a good magazine.
I saw the magazine. I was like, and I had to look when it came out because I was thinking, I'm sure I coined this word. And I've just seen a magazine called Gentlewoman. So I saw that as well. I'm sure I was using this term before it came out.
Okay.
So I have my own style. Definitely. And, I suppose it's that realization of not even wanting to conform. That's the other thing. There was a time I used to go sometimes to straight clubs. And I remember I made one artwork, which is around something I'm sure a lot of women have complained about, the dress codes at straight clubs. I remember going to one straight club. It was somewhere like one Hilton hotel. It was one club night. And the bouncer didn't let me in. And actually, I was in before, but I went out just to go and collect a friend. When I was coming back now, he was like, you can't go in. But I was like, this is ridiculous. One, I always come to this place. Two, I was just in 5 minutes ago. And then he said to me, goes, one, you're not wearing heels. And two, you're not good looking enough or something. No, you're not wearing heels and something else. And what was actually really nice about that moment, because I was just wearing, I thought it was quite nice. It was like a tailored suit, like just a nice tailored, fitted, feminine suit. That's what I would class. And, I had my brogues at the time. And actually, a lot of the women also heard that. They were like, you can't say that. How dare you say something like that?
Yeah, so, I was going to say, how rude.
The women were brilliant. And actually, I felt that kind of sense of unity because obviously, clearly, for me, I just feel like I'm definitely not femme. Right. So I know how I present. But the fact that there was so much solidarity with those women and a lot of them were very femme, wearing high heels, was like, how can you say that? And how does she have to wear high heels just to come in here? So I thought that was brilliant and made a piece around that. And we know it's a similar thing that happens, I think, is it the Oscars or whatever have we, where it's like, how ridiculous that you still have to wear heels in this day and age. So, I think I'm just coming to my own power and I'll do my own things. And I don't dress to impress probably myself, but I don't conform to any of these ideals. I just wear what is comfortable and what I feel good in.
That's perfect. That makes sense. That's like it's so silly because I feel like now it was a really obvious dumb question to ask.
Well, no, of course, I don't think so.
You're gonna say that, but at the same time, I'm like, that's brilliant. That's of course. It's sort of like, well, duh. But at the same time, that's amazing. That's really great.
Yeah, I think it's still part of like Butler's like it's like gender trouble. One of the things I really find very difficult still, and again when I go to a selective few high street stores when I'm buying my clothes. But I always used to Topshop's closed now, but I always used to really hate going into clothes shops, even though I have my unique fashion. I just hate doing it because I feel like I'm this woman who's an imposter in a women's space trying to get clothes. And then there's sometimes I actually want a bit more of a masculine thing. So maybe now and again I might go upstairs because I'm looking for a particular shirt, but I feel out of place. Predominantly mainly in the women's spaces. It's like, okay, well, that's why I go to very select shops to do what I need to do. Or if I have a partner, I always feel better when I have a partner because, okay, yes, I have to be there because she's with me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so that's interesting. Like, I wanted to ask you about this, about being out of place or where you feel like you belong. So I know you left academia, for example, to start your own organization. So, like, was that something to do with belonging, or is that completely separate to
Yes, what I should
the matter
say
of belonging?
is that,
Yeah.
and actually belonging is a really good, and it's a very important term. So I think I speak about belonging and also notions of becoming as well. So maybe we can speak about that a bit afterwards. But belonging in the sense that, so I started a company. I actually started it back in 2015. So the conception of the idea PILAA, so pre-image learning and action, was actually started in 2015. And actually started trading 2017. But like I said, two years ago, just before the first pandemic, I obviously decided to pack it in. I say pack it in. Not because things were terrible, obviously everyone has their challenges and differences, but because I was doing the lecturing alongside doing the business. And, my dad uses a brilliant thing where you have so much work on, it's almost like you're constipated. And because you're constipated, like it moves so slowly, right? So right. I knew I had to let something go. I know it's a crazy. We always laugh about it.
No, that's a great metaphor.
Yes, there you go.
I feel that.
It's like constipation all at one time, and you can't get anything out. And I knew that I had to, because it fundamentally the business PILAA. The whole point of PILAA was about to try to make a difference, but using the visual arts, and it's still a form of teaching. So we do a lot of work with organisations. We're working their policies. We're doing training. We're making visual campaigns. All to do with equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it's all similar to what my research was about. So even the name pre-image learning and action, the pre-image was something I spoke about in my research. So what I knew was that even when I was, from 2009, I was already working. So one of our main clients, Wilson James, they are actually, I was working with them for a long time. So during my PhD, I was working with them. And one of the things I noticed that, the corporate world, everyone is dying for this information about how do we challenge these things. But I'm doing this in a research capacity. I'm doing this at university, but yet you've got these adults, these organisations who want answers. They just don't know how to go about it. So that was when I thought, let's try and put this research to use. Let's try and put this artwork to use, because I think there's many ways that we can become an artist. And I know sometimes it's challenging. I think sometimes we think, okay, well, we need to show our work in these gallery spaces. And I still like that kind of need. I love to still have exhibitions. But actually, if you're not doing it all the time, what does it mean to still show your work, but it shows up in a different space and capacity? So that's really where PILAA came into it. It's about really taking all the academic stuff, taking all the artwork, but putting it into a corporate setting. And, here we are 6 years later. We know now from what we're hearing in the world, there's so many diversity initiatives that everyone is doing something about diversity. But I kind of knew already that it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away because people are not going to go away. There's always going to be differences in the world. So there's obviously going to be a need for someone or an organisation to come in and really try and help people think about how we can challenge these things and really get to the root causes. And this is where I would say that PILAA, where, I can't speak for all the other diversity organisations, but we really try and look at the root causes of why things happen. So we're looking at grassroots levels, using the arts, because we know, as I said before, that images have such an impact, and people really like to respond to that. I always see the world as my especially when I was making artwork, I saw the world as my stage. Like people are props. So it's really just, and it sounds crazy, but that's actually how I would see everything. And I think when you start using it in that very objective way, you can start to understand how people, or the psychology of people and how they behave, why they do certain things. And that's how I would, that's how PILAA really was conceived. So it's still teaching, but just in a different capacity to different people.
Right. That's amazing. And yeah, like you said, kind of really kind of in a way fortuitous timing. This, yeah, like you get every other day, you get an email saying, this is what we're doing, which I know that there's a feeling that it's all kind of performative and that there's, nothing behind it, or, yeah, there's not enough, real impetus and to change behind it, that it's just kind of a,
Yeah, I think, it's
trying
sad.
to look good as opposed to actually really doing something. So, yeah, I mean, how do you get beyond like the performative
Yeah, I think you're
with
right.
your work?
I think you're right. I think, sometimes it's a shame that sometimes it takes major events before, with everything. So until something really bad happens. In the case of George Floyd, it was until the murder of George Floyd. Sadly, again, recently, it was only until the death of the murder, shall I say, both George Floyd and Sarah Everhard, that actually things start to mobilise. And that's actually quite crazy. Otherwise, these things were always and have been happening. So I think that's quite an interesting point to raise as well, that, we have these moments, but were happening long before. It's almost like, I always speak about football. I know things have changed, they might be changing, but again, the taking the knee, we know that was in response to what happened with George Floyd. However, the racism in football is happening way before, and it's funny that it's only now, because of what's happened with George Floyd, that actually if a player walks off before, that maybe 8-9 months ago, in fact, let's say a year ago, before that incident, actually if a black player had walked off because they were facing racism or whatever abuse in the pitch, they would actually be the ones that would be reprimanded, or people say, well, why did you move off? But now, because the moment is right, because now everyone is saying, okay, this is a bad thing, now we're seeing clubs supporting their players, and actually it's okay for the whole team to walk off, or that player to walk off. It wasn't the way 10 months ago. So again, this is where everyone now has changed their kind of tune, because it takes, again, sadly, something terrible before everyone sees from where that person was coming from.
Yeah. So how did you kind of pursue starting the business? Like, even though obviously you did it alongside academia for a while, like how did you get your first clients? And
so it's funny. So I actually, so it's quite an interest. I say it's interesting, but it's quite important, because one thing I know about myself, I always call myself a creature of habit, and I don't, I can stay in particular roles for a long time. So one of our clients is Wilson James, as I mentioned. And actually, when I was 18, I got my first job as a visitor assistant for a service provider. So I think at the time they were called Mighty. And then at 2010, they lost a contract and Wilson James came in. So I was working for this service provider, and it always gets a bit muddy, working for this service provider when I was 18 as a gallery assistant at the Tate. So that's very, very important.
Oh, right.
Yeah, exactly. So if you can imagine, from 18, and they're my main clients, one of my main clients now, and they're a security firm. So when I say security, they do logistics, they do aviation, but they predominantly, but they provide the security officers you'd probably see, and all the kind of like logistics and strategic work for organisations like the Tate, across all the 4 Tates. And they have like a range, they have over like 6,000 employees, lots of clients, different range of clients. So what I've always been doing through my whole of my university career, if you can imagine, from a foundation student when I was 18 until finishing my PhD, which I probably finished at 31, I think, or something like that, I've always been working for them. And again, so this was simultaneous. So I was doing the research, doing the art, working in a place surrounded around art, but then doing all of this thinking and thinking, actually, you know what, I need another vehicle. So like I said, when the PhD had finished, I was thinking, you know what, it's really important that I do this, because I can see that we're working with staff. There's so many people where people need these answers. And, I've been studying this. I always say that, if I had to write a book, which I am writing a book, there's certain questions around how we understand race could be understood in these sorts of environments. whether you were a service provider in a different corporate setting, whatever have we, you can really understand questions around belonging, in-house teams, or what does it mean to, think about immigration or migration? What does it mean when you were an outside community coming in? So there's so much that, I picked up from working there, or working as an employee, and that's how it really happened. So, I think everything happens. I say everything happens for a reason, but it really
That's
does.
amazing. It's like you infiltrated.
Completely. Completely.
Amazing.
And I always see it like, I've killed killed two birds with one stone? Like I've killed like 4 birds with one stone, but I suppose it all started from the artwork. I mean, that's what I would say, is that fundamentally this is all come from my art and knowing that I've wanted to make a difference with the art. That's what I would say.
Right. That just makes me think of like there was that show at the Whitney, Black Male. And there's a piece in that of like security or different uniforms or something. I can't remember who the artist was. The piece I mentioned just now is called Guarded View by Fred Wilson from 1991. It's a set of 4 headless black mannequins. Each one is dressed in a typical security guard uniform. Yeah, so there definitely seems to be, there's... When you encounter a black man in a gallery, it's most often the security person, or
And actually, that's a really good. I mean, yes, these are the kind of stereotypical assumptions, and actually something we're doing. We do with our Wilson James team, because like I said, I do their consultancy for them for the EDI element whilst at Tate. So one of the things we do every Friday, we always do like a Zoom wellbeing session, and it's led by the officers themselves. So this kind of stereotype or this myth that, you see an officer, and some people still use security guards, but they're not guards. They're people, right, and they do amazing things. And each one of them leads a session. And it's like the amount of things that they do, which is beyond what you would ever think, is just absolutely amazing. We've got someone who's working with charities, who've actually started their own charity, people who are working around the environment. It's like, you just don't know. And it's about, I suppose this is where the work comes into it again. It's about how you make those, or what I call the pre-image. We all have these preconceptions about people before we even know what the people are about. And that's, again, why I use the term pre-image. So we need to understand how we've come to understand that person, because all we can see is just the surface. I don't know anything about your values. I don't know anything about what you do, but I have a history of what a black male would do or look like. And we need to try and unpack those sorts of preconceptions. So these Zoom sessions that we have, just really amazing, because you just see the range and the value and the kind of just the talent of these people. And, one of the things I always face is how they're seen, like from visitors, and trying to really challenge those stereotypes.
Yeah, amazing. So pre-image, it's called pre-image learning and action.
And that's
and I noticed that it's one of the services you do is like unconscious bias training. I saw that.
Yeah.
And so go on. What were you going to say about action?
Well, it's an important thing, isn't it? It has to be learning and action. So it's not just about theorizing. It's actually, and that was really, really important. And again, going back to Paulo Freire, he really talks about that as well. So, the image stuff, making the images, talking about them is one thing, but it's okay, how do you now implement that as well? Yeah,
so how do you... Can you give an example, like how you do, like what is the actual work?
So
is there maybe a case study you get?
Yes, I mean, it's funny, someone emailed me today saying that the news, now they're talking about how they're challenging using BAME. So again, the acronym BAME. And it's, again, organisations, again, now really thinking about, okay, well, actually, this is not doing justice to this 4-lettered acronym. Does it even really make sense? If you think about it, you've used racial identity, now you've got geographic location, then you've got like another category, the minority ethnic, which is like, well, what does that mean? It's also, it doesn't make sense, the logic behind these 4 letters, right? So one of the things that we do, and actually recently we've done quite a lot of this, organizations really think, okay, well, if we don't use that, what does it mean? What are the problematics with using certain words as well? Thinking about where is a place of self-identification as well, because the term is just so limited, as we know, right? Especially when you think about Asian in the UK context. When people think about Asian, we're probably speaking about South Asian more so.
Yeah.
But we know in the US, when we're talking about Asian communities, they're probably speaking about...
Yeah, that does not...
Exactly.
That does not mean, Indian or Pakistani.
Exactly.
It means only, East Asian.
Exactly.
People, yeah.
So, we've been working a lot with policies, but, it's for institutions to think about what is the best thing for their employees. It's for the employees to really think about how best they should be described. So we've been doing a lot of guidelines and working along those lines.
I noticed in interviews you've given and texts you've written, you're very particular about language. And for example, person of color is one that you don't like. Could you...
I know, it's true.
I caught myself. I was going to say it earlier, and I was like,
You see, there's so many nuances, isn't there? So
when I was going to describe the Golden Brown Girls, I was like, Indrani Ash works with 2 other women of color. I was going to say.
Well, the thing is, again, this goes back to self-identification. It's what you want to use. Yeah. Personally, I would use black. Again, historically as well, you could probably say, well, black itself could be loaded. But personally, I prefer using it. People of colour or personal...
But now do you capitalize it? Because now, the big deal is, it must be capitalized. Have you know...
I'm not...
I assume you're aware of this.
Yes, but I'm not... what do you call it? I don't want to say I'm not a copy editor, but, I don't get involved. Because, again, everyone has their own style guides as well. For me, that just sounds like semantics. But
yes. Yeah.
Whatever you want to do is fine. But I would just use black. And I think I tend to use a capital B, but again, a copyright will come back and say, actually, can we, do you have an issue if it's not a capital B?
Well, now it's going that direction of capital B.
See, I don't know.
Is the way.
I don't know. Just use black for me. I'm cool. But
there's been a couple of notes about it in certain, I think in the New York Times and in the New Yorker. I guess I'm very New York centric in my media consumption.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because everyone is using their own frames of reference. And that is actually why language can be problematic. You can't use someone else's frame of reference to now mark your own frame of reference. In fact, that's what I suppose all of my artwork and everything I'm doing is challenging that. If you think about trans identities, they're challenging using a heterosexual straight frame of reference to now talk about how I should be labelled. So, people can use whatever they want to use, but again, we have to be very clear and careful that we're all coming from the same hymn sheet, because if we're not, that's where the violence is going to happen. So this is why I say it's best to ask people. I don't really know about the capitalization. It's fine, but for me, and I think when we've done this, we had a brilliant organisation that we were working with, the Paul Mellon Centre. I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying this, but we did a brilliant session. And, I think what is just very clear is that, again, these things are not fixed. You can't just assume just because someone is from said identity group that actually they use said identity terms. But discussion needs to happen. If you don't have a discussion, then we'll just be using generics and a catch-all for everyone when actually we just don't all see eye to eye. Person of colour...
I guess the best...
go for it.
Best tactic is probably just to ask the artist or individual...
Completely.
...how they identify and what terms they use, and then just use them.
Exactly.
So,
if you can do... if you have the time and you can do it, that is the best strategy to use.
The time and you can do it,
because it's going to be difficult. There'll be times where actually you don't...
If they write back to you.
Then you best change it. You should have really done your research anyway. So I think there's times where you just need to do your research and figure out what is the terms that they like to use. So that's definitely one thing. I think the people of colour, the reason why, I've been very anti against using that, but again, it's more current. So, and again, let me not generalise, but I feel it's a term happening more now. I would like to say it's more of a younger generational term, but actually I've got younger people who actually don't like using people of colour or person of colour. I think about the kind of its connections to the US, because it's more of a US term. This is how it started. With most of the things, some of the terms that we've had, they're imports. So for me, it doesn't really make sense within this context. However, I think the other thing is about, by using people of colour, you're also, for me, still recreating those ideologies around race and whiteness. Because whiteness, yes, yes, I understand it in terms of what it does, but actually, by just leaving it out of this mix of, because it's still a colour, people. And I think it's about really understanding that absurdity of what we're saying. So whiteness or white, and I know it depends on how people frame that, but I think this needs to be seen as something which is not universal, because it just starts to operate. And if we don't take it as something which is tangible, then we never really understand how it works. So I think it's more of that conversation. And sadly, I have seen so many variations of people of colour. I've seen persons of colour. I've seen academics of colour. I've seen students of colour, footballers of colour. It's like everything is led by colour. And that for me is the danger of using this catch-all umbrella term. So it's like we're trying to move beyond race and say these things are not a thing, but yet you're still defining this whole group by this.
That is in a nutshell, like the whole problem of, I guess, identity politics. It's
Definitely.
Like, we want to make this claim that language is acting against us, but we have to employ language to make a kind of counter claim or whatever, and then you can be trapped by that language again. So it's just.
I mean, the flip side again. If you're talking about flip sides, it's like you don't hear academics of white or footballers of white, because everything is white. It just doesn't make sense to me. So, but again,
although some people do, like, I think Della Grace Volcano introduces himself as off-white.
That's true.
Frames himself as off-white.
That's true. That's true.
Like off-white.
And I like her.
Off-white from the working class, I think, is the byline.
But it's true, because I think when you start doing that, then you start seeing how absurd something is. And actually, I think Amelia Jones really speaks about this quite nicely. It's like, if you want to see something, and actually there was that brilliant exhibition called White, which is a wayward construction. And they said the only way to make whiteness appear as like, to see it as something, is to make it so radical, to make it so absurd that you have to see it for what it is. So actually, maybe it would be brilliant if we started to say academics of white, students of white, footballers of white, and then you just say, actually, why are we doing this? That's just so crazy. So yeah, maybe we should start flipping the script and using those terminologies. I'm actually going to start doing that.
Yeah, you can feel free to describe me that way. Oriana, the talk show host of White.
There you
go. I'm also other things, but
it's true. No, well, there you go.
I'm also Jewish, and I don't know, I was in a discussion with other Jewish artists, and they were wondering whether BAME covered Jewish identity as well. I don't know if it is a minority, but I don't know. But then people get critiqued for framing their Jewishness before their whiteness. It's like, no, you've got to. It's identify yourself as white first.
Well, again, it's down to the individual, because funny, before I came on here, I was really thinking about that. The two things which I think are important to me, but again, maybe perhaps race trumps sexuality, even though actually that's really big, but I suppose because race can be seen, or, my racial identity, you're going to see that. But perhaps you may say that my sexuality can be seen too, depending if you can pick up the codes of what...
Yeah.
what being a lesbian might look like. But then again, in this day and age, everything's a little bit changed, really. Back in the days, you could have gaydar, and I could probably say spot a lesbian and just think, look at her nails. I would look at how she's dressed, but that doesn't mean anything now because everyone's so diverse, so it means nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something, I talked about on the episode about masculine sexuality. It was called Time's Up, Penis Down. And I had a fashion academic, and he was saying, he was talking about how the way certain, fashion trends are taken from, gay communities or, borrowed and brought into the mainstream. And likewise, Black culture is often, goes from being, is really instrumental in mainstream fashion, like copying those trends. But I was saying, how wouldn't it be great if instead of just the trend being taken on by the mainstream, but just the questioning of, the fixedness of identity, if that could also come into play, if that could be made mainstream, then that would be, really productive. And
really
maybe
like
it
that.
is. Maybe it is to some extent. Like, I don't know, or maybe that's a move that PILAA is making.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think perhaps what you're talking about then is just the codes then. So I really like what you said about, sometimes it's the trends, but, let's go beyond that to, I think what you're talking about is the codes. And I think that's really important because a lot of the work is around really breaking what those codes are, being able to read what those codes are. And actually, if a code is done in a particular way, then you can do it differently. A really brilliant example would be about boys and girls' clothing and the colours pink and blue. Actually, historically, it wasn't this way around, but that's a code. That's what we call a gender code. And people say that this is natural. This is, and I know because, I've got nieces and nephews now. And I always find it such a struggle to buy them clothes because I'm thinking, but pink and blue, it's like I can't break away from this thing. And people are so adamant, she really likes it, he really likes it, or children, because the whole clothes stores. But little do people know that 100 years ago, it wasn't this way. It was the other way. And we had a different narrative to say why blue was a colour for girls and why pink was a colour for boys. But people have forgotten that. So again, these are gendered codes or codes, and it's how we understand the world. But because they are learned, it also means that they can be unlearned. So I really like that idea of what you've just said. If we can go beyond that and scrap it and just, do what...
Yeah, that relates to what you said about, like, not liking the term systemic. Was it systemic racism that you don't like? You prefer structural.
No, so...
structures could change? Or is it the other way around?
It's the other way around. So people say systemic, and obviously there's a space for both. I mean, it's whatever you want to use. So you've got systemic. So we're talking about deeply ingrained, and you've got systematic. Systematic is a way of doing something. So actually, they kind of look similar, and I would say they do similar things. But when you understand it as systematic, then you understand it as a system. It's a process. It's a way of doing something. It also means that it's not fixed. When you say something like systemic, it's almost like it's deeply ingrained. But just because it's deeply ingrained doesn't mean it gives it the idea that it's fixed, and it's still not fixed. So I prefer to use systematic rather than systemic.
Systematic rather than
so it shows that it's a process.
Okay,
systematic. So you're even confusing me now.
Sorry.
So people say systemic racism. I'll just say systematic racism. Systematic racism.
It sounds a bit more conscious in a way, though, with systematic. Systemic.
I think I mentioned earlier about this.
Maybe it's just that you want to foreground the fact that we could consciously change it as opposed to
definitely
the fact that it's
and that's what it is.
Locked in.
That's what it is. And I mentioned before about these notions of becoming, right? So if you keep on doing something, it's almost like repetitive behaviors or stereotypes. Keep on doing it day in, day out, it becomes a thing, right?
Yes.
So it's the same sort of thing. Like the narratives we carry. If we keep on seeing things in this particular way, then it becomes naturalized. So for me, it's about really trying to, as you just said, to show that these things are just they're not natural. They can be undone.
Yeah, and actually I was reading in a book the other day some studies that have been done that show that, like, if people are told certain stereotypes before they have to perform a task, like a test or something, like if women are told, reminded of the stereotype that, like, women do better at verbal than maths, and then they're given a math exam, they will do worse than if they weren't reminded of the stereotype before.
Wow, there you go. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So, it really does, like, impact behavior being told, this is how it's meant to be, or this is the stereotype. And then you're like, I'm going to then enact that, and I'm going to then... I mean, it's strange. But it's, it just shows how powerful
Definitely.
they are.
And I think, you're talking about performativity there. And also, I mean, I've just been rereading a book by called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. And again, so I think there's that element of it, like maybe some of these things are culturally learned. But one of the things he also speaks about is the way that the brain is actually hot wired. So there's certain parts of the brain where actually the response you have is based on the information that the brain has. And again, I'm not a psychologist or a neuroscientist to give you the specifics of all the different parts of the brain, but it's just so enlightening. So if you've only experienced something like, I don't know, say by default, someone has robbed you. Actually, not a really good one, it's not a nice story. But say you keep on seeing, okay, we know what a keyboard is. So your brain is already hot-wired to know that, okay, well, this is a keyboard. Now, if you see a keyboard which is half the size, I'm talking about a computer keyboard, you see one which is like maybe the size of my pen, you might still be shocked about it, but what the brain will do is just try and pick, okay, what's the closest thing to this little pen, like to this little size keyboard, and it will give you a match. So it will tell you, okay, that actually this could be like a keyboard, this little thing, even though it's not properly a keyboard, it's kind of like a keyboard. So your brain will give you the closest match to that thing. So any new experience, again, your brain will only do that based on what is in there. So this is so interesting when you start to think, this is what I say, experience is brilliant, because the more information that you have to feed your brain, and your brain will start expanding itself. It will give you the closest match to those things. So it's a really brilliant book to pick up. I mean, it's probably about over 10 years old and stuff like that, but it's just so key. And I think actually when we're talking about all of these things, we are also talking about emotional intelligence, or a different set of knowledges other than the way that we do things.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't want to take too much of your time. I don't know if you've got to rush off and do other things. I'm trying to think, is there anything? Oh yeah, I did notice though that you never use butch and femme. You never use you don't seem to ever use those terms. You said stud, and you said, wait, did you say?
Yeah, I only use those terms because of how we were trying to describe my identity. The funny thing is, my work, this is why I say I talk about race and gender and how the interconnections. It's never really been about sexuality in that way. It's been about homoerotic desires. Actually, it doesn't need to have been, LGBT characters. It could have been anyone. This is just about what happens when bodies come together. So it's funny. This is where sometimes when people try and place my work, I think they probably find it quite difficult, because I'm talking about these, I'm talking about intersectionality. I'm talking about all of these nuances. The nuances are just not just with race and gender. It might be how people dress. So again, we've talked about dress, and actually it's really important. Yeah. We're talking about the use of props, but it's just about how bodies come together. One of the things I really like, I have a lot of my work, especially something like I Want Me Some Brown Sugar, which was obviously speaking about online pornography and some of the critique of online pornography. But in that images, you saw people walking. For whatever reason, actually, I won't say for whatever reason, I love seeing people either sitting at bus stops or just sitting. I like seeing strangers sitting together. I like seeing just the body language. I like people walking, and that's a lot of the works. I always has someone either walking really slowly, walking really quickly, but I just love that interaction. So it's always about bodies coming together, not necessarily about, because you wouldn't know what their sexuality is. So really those terms are not really part of it. It just so happens that, yes, the work implies it. So this is the thing. So it implies, but it's not necessarily about that.
Right, I see. So that's why those words are absent. Interesting.
And so, so the walking is really important. I think also what's important is that as much as the themes are really crucial to my work, at the same time, I love video work. I love it because I like the look of it. I love the aesthetics of it as well. And this is why I always talk about guilty pleasures. I might look at certain paintings which might be problematic because of the content, but I really love them. I love how I like to look at them. I love to see the colours that the artists have used. So aesthetics is really important for me, or pleasure. And pleasure operates on so many levels, not just about how, the women or the people that we use, but actually in the image itself. So even when I think about artists, which, I really love their work, it's not necessarily just because they're talking about things which I find interesting, but because visually, they're sensational. So even like, old school, that type, that term, sensationalist artwork, I still love all that sort of stuff. Artists, I suppose that I really resonate with. And again, people may or may not see it, but someone like Bill Viola, which probably for a lot of his always, I know I had to say this, but he's always been, because I think his work is also touched you on a deeper level. Visually stunning, beautiful to look at, but also I think, and this is probably where, especially this newest piece I've just done for Autograph, I think I'm trying to move to those bits as well. I think your work can touch you, and I've always tried to do that in terms of, I know that a work is completed when I feel that, it's really stirred something in me. Like I feel like I can look at it, and I always say that I feel like I'm turned on by looking at my own work. Then I know that it's done. Like if you feel turned on by it and you can't articulate it because there's a bit of taboo, like I shouldn't really like it, but I really like it. Like it's turning me on, sort of thing. So that's like a tick for me.
I wish I knew that before the interview, because I would have put that in the introduction. She's turned on by her own work.
You have to be, because if you're not, who else is going to be turned on by it? The aesthetics is so important. So Bill Viola, but I love the spiritual element. And I think for me, it's about really trying to connect with the work itself. Yes, it's a 2D image, it's presented on the screen, but can we go beyond that? And that's why something like I Want Me Some Brown Sugar, quite different and quite a brilliant commission. That was at the 198. It had about 8 different screens, but it was also the space that people came together. You had an intersubjective space. So you're still looking at something which is very challenging, slightly taboo. It's online pornography. And you're having, people didn't know about this work. It was really referencing how online pornography, you had people commenting. So behind the scenes, you've got these images, and it's always like these interracial images. People, I suppose now in this day and age, we'll call it trolling, but people will say certain things, but they can hide nicely behind it.
Right.
Right. So it's kind of allowed. So I would scroll, I think for that particular piece, I had a license to scroll porn basically, and to look at different categories, whether it was straight sex, whether it was lesbian sex. And I say lesbian sex, for me, it didn't feel like lesbian sex. It's more of like, well, a guy probably created this lesbian sex, or
right.
These two women. You had interracial gay male sex, which I found very interesting as well. And it was about how these users would comment on all of these different categories. And for the straight sex, all of them are all interracial. So whether it's straight, gay, lesbian, all interracial. For the straight sex, it was interesting. There was a lot of master-slave narratives. Like, users will say, very, I don't say sordid, but very stereotypical kind of S&M theme going on. You had the gay male sex where it seemed very pleasurable. Like there was a lot of fetishism within that interracial mix. Again, just the lesbian ones, I'm not sure exactly what kind of thing was going on there. It didn't really feel very much lesbian. So there's a different way of thinking. So you had all of these comments that these people had said behind the scenes, which I actually brought to the fore. So on all of the 8 screens, you actually had, well, this person, blah, blah, blah. And that would be scrolling. And the only words which were kind of like highlighted were the black and white. So you had the text, but then in capital letters were whenever you saw black and white. So you've got viewers now in this space, in this very dark lit space. You're seeing these free-floating texts. And for me, it's also about, well, who's thinking this? Who's saying this? Who's thinking this? And I think if we're kind of honest with ourselves, I know it's quite challenging for some people, but I think some people enjoyed it because I think there's also that taboo or that kind of inner desire which perhaps we may not want to speak about, but which is still there, which is still very important. So, it was quite an eye-opening piece. But again, aesthetically, I thought it was beautiful. But again, it also had the impact. And I think it could touch people on another level, on a deeper level.
So, but that's interesting, though, that it seems like it was all mainstream-ish porn. Like, there wasn't any... Was that a purposeful choice? Is that because you wouldn't find that kind of trolling voices on, like, maybe an alternative?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's a really good point. But yeah, it had to be. It was mainstream. Yeah, it was mainstream porn. And again, actually, something like that, it did spur me on to think about really how porn is perceived, and actually if different filmmakers also think about what does it mean if it was a lesbian filmmaker to actually make porn. I think another interesting part was about how do people identify when looking at porn, because I think that's also another area which, I was trying to do some work on, probably still will revisit, but really thinking about looking and recognizing. And, I mentioned earlier, over this lockdown, I've joined probably quite a lot of meetup groups, different networks, and I'm sure this conversation actually came up. And it actually came up, and there's a group called Lesbian Table Talk. And it's organised by this wonderful young woman, I say young woman, but it's a wonderful woman called Kat Taylor. And in it, I'm sure we discussed about porn and thinking about how we identify when we're looking at porn as women. As women, some of us are lesbians, some are bi, some are queer, some are non-binary. But it's interesting, if you're looking at straight porn, for example, who do you identify with? It doesn't mean by proxy because you're a woman, you identify with a woman. There are some people who might identify with the man's position. We know that porn is filmed in such a way that sometimes they cut off the bodies or the women's bodies so that if you're a guy, perhaps you just see the woman's body. If you're a woman, perhaps maybe you don't want to see the woman's body, so they have more shots to do with the male. So looking and recognition is so crucial in that. There might be obviously people who look at different types of porn because they're looking for something different. Or, we were learning that some people want more rough looking sex. Actually, there was a lot of lesbians who were looking at gay male porn as well. So really interesting.
That's in that movie. There's that movie, kind of Hollywood movie. Is it The Kids Are All Right or something? And
right.
Anyway, they show there's a lesbian. It centers around a lesbian couple, Annette Bening, I think, and Julianne Moore play the leads, and they watch gay porn together. Like that's kind of
there you go
thing.
And actually, you know what? That's
gay male porn.
Yes, exactly.
That's
exactly. I need to watch that film. Actually, I forgot when it was on. I was like, oh, that actually looks interesting and funny. So I need The Kids Are All Right. Is it?
Yeah, it was funny. It's a funny movie. But yeah, not the best movie.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. I guess, and like mainstream portrayals of, I don't know.
True.
Lesbian relationships are always, I guess to some extent problematic.
Yeah.
But yeah, did you say, like, I asked you the question about like an example of the action, and you talked a lot, and I feel like, did you say what you did though? Like, I feel like I still don't feel like I have a really great understanding of.
Yeah, so it's more just about, it's just putting all the training, what you've learned into action. So whether you think about strategies, so, we do all the training and then people may work on policies. So again, like a physical output, for example, we were working with one organisation, again, challenging the use of BAME, and we helped them to put a guide together with preferred terms. But again, this was done as an organisation. So we had a really big intervention and they've got a guide from that. So it's learning and implementing action.
Right. Does the action ever include, like, I guess, affirmative action? Like, trying to get people, underrepresented people into leadership positions? Or is it just a matter of, like, ensuring that you're following the equality policy or the equality laws or whatever?
Yeah,
I feel like that's the bare minimum. And sometimes, like, what's really needed is something more than just...
Yeah, what we do is all bespoke in terms of every client will probably same issues, but they may have a different thing that they want to work on, whether it's around recruitment, whether it's around policies. It's just a range of different things. So it's just about how they apply that to what they're doing. So yes, in a nutshell, yes.
Okay.
It just depends on what they want to do. We talk them through it and they will apply it, and hopefully we will see changes in that as well.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things is it just how you measure it? And, I think when people try and measure it in a kind of business sense, it's probably not the best, because I think this kind of work I think he's an academic still. His name is Clive Nwonko. And he wrote, and this was a long time ago, actually, I think just around the opening of Tate, so around 2000, I'm sure he wrote an article. And it's like, look, diversity has been around for a long time. Like, we're still doing diversity now. And the reason why it's still going to be around is because we keep on looking at it from a business perspective. But how can you talk about making a change to people or do all this kind of work and use a business framework? So it doesn't work. So when people want to try and measure, and then you want to have like data to measure how people are now, it's already going to cause a bit of a friction. So what we've just found is that, the work that we do, some of our clients are really long lasting. So it's a process. I would always say, like, diversity is a process. And, it's just continued investment in this. And I think over time, it's like the long game. You can see those changes. Sometimes you can see it very, like, individually. You might have clients or people who said, actually, you know what, this has really made a difference. I've changed in my approach into how I do things. A really great example, we had a security team member who was saying, like, some time ago that, these first aid forms are actually not brilliant, because actually, how do you put in, where do trans people fit? How do non-binary people fit in your typical first aid form? It just has male, female. I was like, brilliant. I didn't even need to tell you that, but you were already thinking in that way. So it's things like that make the difference.
Right. Yeah.
You can't measure that. There's no kind of form that says, okay, well, what experience, So I think that's one of the trickiest parts. But if you're okay with knowing that you're measuring something which is not necessarily tangible, but a change is occurring, then that's a different conversation.
I see. So what about, like, the, potential critique that you are making, turning your politics into something that can be profited from? Like, that's still, like, fitting within, like, capitalism or whatever. Like, it is, how do you do you see your kind of your politics aligned with or against capitalism, or how does it align with, like, anti-capitalist politics?
Yes.
How do you put that in practice within a business?
Yeah. So this is a thing. But businesses, everything needs to be sustained. And actually, one of the main reasons as well for starting a company is because I really wanted to fight against that myth of the suffering artist. Like, there's nothing else that we can do. And I also wanted to give opportunities to artists and to young people who have done art. Especially, this is the thing. It's like when I left, my degree, and I've still been in education, but there's no job that is attached to doing a fine art degree. So you're getting students who we're always complaining about the same thing. What do we do? It's like, I can't make money and this and that. So yes, one of the main things is that actually I wanted to have a business where actually there could be a profession. And actually there's artists who are, and you use a brilliant word, entrepreneur. I don't like using it for myself, but I always say that artists are entrepreneurs. I would call myself a hustler. There's people who are hustlers, and we have to think creatively of how to exist. So that's one thing. The other thing is about this kind of work. There's no reason why this kind of intensive labour should not be paid for, because actually it's one of the most, I think it's a really difficult job. I think it's that kind of mindset that sometimes you get people doing this work and actually they're not getting paid for it. Or people say, well, it should be charitable work. There's no reason why this work should not be more important than any other kind of work. And again, I think that's the mindset, because sometimes you'll get people who are going to be exploited on that premise. So that's actually my take on it. I think things should be fair. And there's a lot of people, like I said, who've been doing this work for time, and you should be paid for your time. So again, this is about playing the game, being the game, changing the game. There's no reason why this sort of work should not be on the same sort of footing as sciences. We know when it comes to, like, we've done our PhDs now. When it came to being funded, science PhDs, you get funding all the time. When I did my PhD, there was no funding. This is the funding of father and siblings and mother, Yeah. It's like, it's a struggle. So I think it's for me, again, it's also about just changing that mindset, and it needs to be sustainable. There's brilliant organisations. I forgot what the other one was. It's a disability charity, but again, they knew the impact of you have to have a business model, or else it won't survive. People should be paid. Everyone should be paid for what they do. Like, especially when I was thinking about my artwork, I make sure I pay actors. Everything should be fair. So similar sort of thing. I want to make sure that everyone is paid for what they're bringing, and that what they're bringing is sometimes it's actually priceless. You can't really put amount of money on this.
That's a brilliant answer. Yeah, really good. So important. And so.
There you go.
So perfect. Yeah. Just because it's exactly the kind of things I've been thinking about, and fighting with internally, like in terms of, how do I value my own practice if it doesn't make money, and basically the answer is like to actually insist that it is worth money.
Yeah, because you just said it as well. You're fighting internally, and you're right. I think that that internal fight left after a while, and I was like, this is so important. And the thing is, this kind of work anyway, organisations were doing it. Normally HR would probably do this kind of work. But again, everyone needs help. Like, they've been dying to get people who would actually be able to articulate it in a different way. So, again, there's no money, I think, that can be even put on this sort of work, because I think the benefits are brilliant. It's brilliant to know that sometimes you've gone into an organisation, you've made a difference. It was just to one person who said, actually, that really helped me. But there is a lot of labour. Like, it's emotionally, I don't say draining, because that sounds like a negative thing, but it can be difficult and it can be challenging. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, especially to connect with different clients. It's not just like surface level. You really want to make sure that you've done something that has made a difference. So it's labour intensive.
Yeah, but I think it's so important, like what you're saying. I feel like it's an uphill battle, though, because we've got the government, like they produced that advert that was like, do you know the one? It was like a dancer.
Yes.
It says Fatima is now considering a career in cyber.
Yes.
So it's like you really need a lot more images saying that, especially to non-white students who are considering going into art, like that this is a viable lifestyle or livelihood. That it's not just you're going to leave and then just have to go into cyber or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's again, I mean, it's funny you should bring that. So, I mean, a lot of our work as well, because like I said, pre-image learning actually, so we do a lot of our content as well, but we also look at these adverts, because I think that's a good way of learning around things and really unpacking what's been said. So I remember that particular campaign, wasn't it? Was it the entertainment secretary or whoever helped put that campaign together? So obviously they got it wrong, and people get it wrong as well. There's so many times that they get it wrong, but then you had to think, how many times can you keep on getting it wrong without actually it being something which is quite strategically done as well? Something that I would say that's actually quite strategically done.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one you said about, again, it's not necessarily just about non-white students. I think a lot of students, I think it's about the arts as well.
Or it would be just working class, or, anybody who's, not coming from a place of privilege to pursue an art education seems like a luxury or something, or like maybe a foolhardy choice, or it can, there's that logic that has to be fought.
Well, I wouldn't agree necessarily, but you come from a place of privilege, because I think there's another thing about the arts as well. And it's funny because I hopefully there's a project that will be going on with a colleague from a FE school with a university, and they're really thinking about how students come into the university space, not necessarily just from a wider participation element, but actually, and I think this is just like myself, I went to private school, and I remember that actually no one talked about art. They didn't talk about art because they didn't believe that art would bring any sort of money. So I know people say from a place of privilege, but art is not seen as one of those topics, regardless of economic status that people are in. And actually one of the some of the stakeholders before students do anything are the parents. If parents don't believe that there's any benefit in doing art, you're not going to get that. So actually what you want is someone who, maybe if you have parents who are quite worldly and kind of see the benefit in cultural institutions, but for a lot of parents at that age, my dad was the same. But actually what saved me, my dad heard about St. Martin's, so he was like, okay, yeah, cool. But it was a battle.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was a battle because it's like, well...
No, I'm really lucky with my parents. Like, they always were they were like... They were really into like finding what their child's talent was, whatever that is, and then like encouraging that. And like I was always just like, encouraged. Like the thought of whether it would make money, that did not enter into it. It was just like they have this talent, they have to pursue it.
So that's really good.
That kind of, yeah.
And I think this is where we're not. Sometimes we are talking about race, sometimes we're talking about class, but I think also what you're speaking about is something we call a cumulative advantage as well. And we're talking about what do your parents instill in you so that you can go and do certain things. So, for some children, they may not have that. They may not have someone who's told them that actually, well, you know what, there could be a career in that. Right. So I think that's quite a big area. And especially when you think about maybe art schools in London and those outside, some people outside have no clue about the art schools in London because, again, it's the hub where everything happens. So I think there's so many things that stop people from doing the arts. You also know that the governments now, I don't know whether, how art sits in the curriculum. I can't remember whether it was a few years ago where they've stopped certain funding. So all of these things are part of it as well. You got less people doing it. So there's going to be no need for it. I think one of the biggest questions for me, actually, and maybe we're going off a tangent here, but it's something, again, maybe I'm slightly trying to work on, is around thinking about the attainment gap, especially when we're thinking about art. Now, if we're using the premise that, when everyone does art, especially at school, if you went to school like mine, which was very traditional, so all they had was art, not in this day and age where actually you have maybe fashion and textiles, art, photography, we just had art. So if everyone starts on that premise that we've all gone into, and we do our foundation as well, so we're all learning the very basics, then we get into the foundation, it'll be really interesting to know how certain students end up doing particular genres or particular have particular practices. So, for example, something I always notice during my lecturing, and even as a student as well, it always seemed that the white males would be doing painting, probably doing really massive paintings on canvases. Black students or LGBT students would be doing performance artwork, right? And it just seems so absurd to me. I mean, I even started as a painter. Yeah, me too. Well, there you go. And isn't it crazy that we ended up, and obviously maybe better for it, I can't knock it because I enjoy what I do, but isn't it crazy then, given the things that we are talking about, feminism, gender, that we've been positioned with doing performance and video for film, for video, for TV, whatever have we. Isn't that crazy? And
it's something I think about a lot.
Well, there we go.
I think about it a lot because, I think about particularly like my kind of dislike of certain of abstract painting, for example.
Right.
Like I've grown in appreciation for abstract painting from teaching at the kind of traditional art school where I teach, because I realized that, yes, that exact phenomenon is something, or because being educated in the 90s, going to art school in the late 90s, meant that if you're going to be a feminist artist, that means you do video, performance, photography. You don't do, I was a painter. I studied painting and I have a degree in painting. So I continue to do that. But I did have this perception somewhere along the line that if you're going to do work about identity politics, it's not going to be in paint. Or maybe I did feel limited by, not being able to use language. Like I felt like I went into video and performance because I could use language as opposed to just visual, painterly language. But at the same, basically, I read this book by Darby English called 1971: A Year in the Life of Color. Have you seen this book? Anyway, and it was so mind blowing to me. Just the introduction was all about how, it's all to do with that kind of the way Black abstract painters have been sort of dismissed as like not doing identity politics, not doing it right, like not, they're conforming to like this male white paradigm of painting. But actually, Darby English is saying that's just that sense that like if you do that's so confining. We're supposed to be we should be free to do abstract painting, even if we're a woman or even if we're Black. Like it's just these are languages that need us, that need our perspectives brought to them, not just like it's not just through video and film and and performance that we can make our mark. Like we could also do these other things that we didn't historically have a stake in, but now we can. Anyway, there's lots of I feel like movement towards.
I need to read that book. Yeah. I really need to read that book because I think that's exactly it. So when we're talking about attainment gaps, and I always say I would use a Trojan horse. Let's not talk necessarily about, because obviously when people start talking about race, they probably would get anxious and think, oh, this is another thing. So I always say use a Trojan horse. If you use a Trojan horse, then it becomes less kind of in your face that actually we're trying to deal with this particular issue. So instead of talking about, how predominantly home students of Black and Asian minority ethnic, whatever have we, are disproportionately getting the 2 1s and the 2 and the thirds, the 2 2s and the thirds and whatever have we. Let's think about the practice itself.
For my listeners who are not based in the UK, the degree classifications that Ope just mentioned are, lower performing marks. So 70% out of 100 is like a 2-1. And below that, you'd get into 2-2 territory. And then a third class degree in the UK would be the equivalent of just passing and getting mostly Ds.
Let's think about, who's painting what? If we start working kind of backwards, then I think we would get better kind of responses or better buy-in as well, because this is an issue which is not changed, right? So we had to really think about how this is affecting all of those students. And it's funny you talk about that again. So this is where, a lot more collaboration needs to come into really addressing something like this. I remember as a painter, and I thought I was really brilliant at painting, but again, it's not necessarily because
I thought the same thing about myself.
There you go. So the issue's not us. And this is also like social. The issue was never us. It's about how those others or those tutors read our work. The fact that they couldn't understand perhaps how we would still talk about feminism and this and whatever through painting. That is the issue. Right, so when you even get like
Well, I had a really discouraging tutor at Goldsmiths who was a painter himself, and he purposely like discouraged all the painters from painting because and he ended up doing really well. Like he's he has a fancy gallery representation and stuff, and like it's quite famous, and it's really annoying. But I had him, and I also had Virginia Nemarco, who I know you've written about her work. So I had Virginia, so that was
your saving grace.
That was good. Yeah, my saving grace. Totally.
But it's true. You always need someone. Similar to you, I probably had the same experience, and I had probably had, actually at the time, I had Hilary Thompson and Brian. So when I was doing when I went to Chelsea, actually that was a time where I really came out of myself and really enjoyed it. And, I think it's just because they gave me a license just to do what I needed to do. But actually, I was a painter before, and I always use this term, I was passing to pass. In other words, that when I would paint, again, I would use colours which I think like flesh tint, raw umber, because I knew that, one, I had to try and paint myself or people that, I don't want to say look like me, but I was painting figures which were ambiguous. You couldn't tell their racial identity. So in fact, it's called ethnically ambiguous. You couldn't tell their racial identity. They weren't black, they weren't white, because it'd be weird for me to paint someone white, but you couldn't read it. And that was the only way I could pass. So I call it passing to pass, because passing is kind of like a historic racial reference. So we're talking about, I say the US, but think about how those who are black could pass either symbolically or through their skin, because they were so light, they could kind of pass as white. And so I thought I was passing to pass.
Well, it's
basically
also used in gay people passing as straight as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a brilliant book called
even trans people passing as their, as their
everyone
chosen.
Is passing. Everyone does some sort of passing. Brilliant book called Neo-Passing came out in 2018. So, even if you think about the workplace, working class people passing as middle class, right? And in fact, a brilliant study that came out LSE about a few months ago, where it was middle class people passing to be working class in the workspace. And the reason that they do that is so that people feel that what they've achieved is down to merit and not down to privilege. So even when your parents have both been middle class, you yourself are in a managerial position that would be deemed as middle class, you still call yourself working class. That's even more crazy, right?
That is crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So the classing, again, I would say that's the elephant in the room. And we know sometimes that gets conflated with race and vice versa.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we should really talk more about this, isn't it?
I hope this is the beginning of many conversations.
No, I hope so too. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, listeners, for sticking with us to the end of that rather long interview. I hope you found it as meaningful as I did. I really like the way we spoke about specific works and about the way in which the research and the practice-based work that she's done has provided her with the expertise that she now employs in her organization, PILAA, PILAA, Pre-Image Learning and Action, which helps organizations to improve on their diversity efforts. And if you want to know more about PILAA, go ahead and visit their website, which is pilaa.co.uk. I put those details also in the show notes. And if you know anyone who is questioning the value of art that addresses identity politics and the role that it can play in the world, then please have them listen to this interview. Tell them about it. I'd really appreciate it. And I know they will too. If you'd like to see some of Ope Lori's actual artwork, it's going to be on view in London this September. That's September 2021, at a gallery called Autograph in Shoreditch. And again, I'll put the details of that in the show notes.
Next time on Multiple O's. Next time on Multiple O's.
So next time on Multiple O's, I'm talking to the stand-up comic Jay McBride. She's a New York-based comic, and the conversation we have addresses self-deprecating humor, the power of empathy, and trans visibility. So if you want to know when that episode becomes live, please do subscribe.
O's. Next time on Multiple O's.
And the way to subscribe is to go to wherever it is you find your podcasts and click the subscribe button. So on iTunes or Spotify or Podchaser. So click subscribe or follow, and then you'll be notified every time there's a new episode of Multiple O's. Just thinking about something that Ope Lori was talking about toward the end of that interview, about the fact that diversity initiatives are not new, but also that they're not only just extremely relevant and timely at the moment, but they're going to continue to be necessary because we live in such a pluralist world. There's always going to be differences between people, and therefore the need to make organizations equitable and diverse and inclusive is going to continue to be a really important thing to do. So with that in mind, it's therefore also really important to unconditionally accept ourselves and others and our lives, because we're all just fallible human beings.
Oh.